John W. Peace was born and raised on a family dairy farm in the quaint Appalachian community of Crackers Neck, Virginia. John grew up hearing the stories of living legends from the greatest generation, including his own grandfather, Jimmie Galloway, who was a B-17 bomber pilot and a card-carrying member of the Lucky Bastard Club, reserved for those who flew and survived at least 30 missions. Captain Jimmie Galloway passed on his masterful storytelling talent to John by sharing his experiences as they worked together side by side on the farm. Now we can all enjoy and appreciate these stories through John's book, A Boy from Crackers Neck, which is full of the history of our nation and pictures that transport us back to that time. John, thank you for joining us all here on Triumph Talks. I would like to start by just asking you, why did you write this book?
Well, first, I want to thank you for having me on the show, Triumph Talks. Gosh, that was such an elegant introduction. And you talk about storytelling, but that's such a polite way of saying he can talk a lot. But anyway.
Well, I think the listeners are going to learn
my granddad could talk a lot.
But they're also going to find out you're very interesting. So it's not
okay. Well, I hope so. I hope
so. Right ahead.
Yeah, he could talk a lot, and I think he did pass that on to me and stuff. Get back to your question. I'm sorry. Why did I write the book? Well, first of all, 6 months to a year ago, the last time I wrote anything was some grad school papers 20 some years ago. So absolutely a little bit shocked to even be sitting here and having a book and talking about a book. I knew the stories by heart. And probably back in 2015, I came down with a condition called tinnitus, which is extreme ringing of the ears and stuff. And which makes sleep very, very hard at times, very, very hard at times. And tinnitus is a funny thing, can come and go. But speaking of like nights that I couldn't sleep, I would get up, you couldn't sleep, TV wasn't really comfortable, radio and stuff. So I started writing down his stories. And I wanted to preserve them for a couple reasons. One was getting ready to have my first grandchild. My son's getting ready to have a son. And I just kind of wanted to pass on these stories. I didn't, and one thing I was telling a person just the other day, and they were asking about the book, and they were talking about it, and I said, I wanted to write down a lot of little stories and little events, because the big things are already in history books. The big events. They have markers along the road, they have monuments, and they're already in. But just it was making me sad to think about some of the stories I'd heard. Once I'm gone, they're just going to be, faded away to time. So I started jotting down the stories. And then I never even thought about contacting like yourself, a book editor. There was a local, he was a dear family friend, grew up in the Crackers Neck community, and he passed away. And it was kind of one of those realizations when you live in a small community. Crackers Neck's inside Powell Valley. When I grew up, you could ride around the valley and you knew every family and knew where everybody lived. And, when Ben Mullins passed away, we were outside the funeral home, and I was realizing he was probably one of the last of if you want to call them the old timers, old guard that lived in our community. And we'd lost so many of those old guards. And then I kind of realized I'm the old guard. And I have a younger brother, but he's 10 years younger than me. So he didn't really grow up here, meeting the same people I did or hearing the same stories that I did. And I realized when I'm gone, I've kind of told my children the stories, but they make more impact when you hear them firsthand. And I can't quite tell them the way my granddad did and with the same importance, because he was there. So I wanted to jot them down and preserve them. And like I say, never thought I'd write a book.
I would point out, though, that you actually wrote very much in first person, or at least telling the story. What I love about your book is you're telling the story as if you're there. So you share a lot of experiences that your grandfather had in the flying fortress, the B-17.
Yes.
And as we read it, we're not reading it like, this happened and then that happened. It's like you're hearing the conversation that happened between him and the crew.
Mm-hmm.
So it appears to me, and I know from our conversations as we worked on the book, it appears to me that you heard these stories so many times
Yes.
that you were actually able to very correctly write them as if you were there. Would you say
Well, I
that?
hope so.
Yeah.
Yes, I hope so. And, try to put them down as much as I could remember. I also want to try to, get the core details correct.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a history writer. This wasn't a history book. It wasn't, that's not the
Well, I
point
think your
of the
readers will
book.
disagree with
Well,
that. I think they're going to
yeah,
help you write more history books.
but I wanted to tell the stories from a firsthand person.
Mm-hmm.
They were so traumatic in so many ways, and you know, gosh, I wish I was a better writer to even put down more emotions and stuff that these men went through and
Well, we're
stuff.
going to have you read an excerpt from your book in a little while, and I think that will
Okay.
really be a great way for those who are watching to hear just how great your writing is, because you're putting yourself down, and I am very
Oh,
actually I feel very honored to have published this book because the stories are extremely important. They're not
yes.
stories you've heard before. I kept saying as I was working on this book, gosh, if we could just send this to a screenwriter,
Yes.
this would be every bit as good as Band of Brothers. And
Yes.
actually, not to date this, but we have a movie coming out this coming January that is done by the same people that did Band of Brothers and
Mm-hmm.
it was in the Southern Theater. I forget what they called that one.
Oh, the Pacific. You
Pacific,
had the
thank you.
Pacific Band of
And
Brothers
so we've
and
got a movie coming out about the
Saving
bomber.
Private Ryan. The same, yeah.
Yeah, I'm
Mhm. excited
excited to see it. And I have a feeling when I watch it, I'm going to be going, oh, the stories in John's book really belonged in here. So,
Well,
but along those lines, I wanted to ask you, what do you hope that readers will take from having read your book?
okay, like you've already mentioned, like Band of Brothers. I've mentioned in other conversations with you about the book Greatest Generation by Tom Brokaw,
Mm-hmm.
and wonderful, wonderful book, wonderful miniseries. I've talked to the veterans in my book talked about how accurate those movies were and everything, but there was a couple elements I felt that they left out. A lot of times in the book and the miniseries, they talked about these men of the Greatest Generation, these men that fought World War II. Well, they were tough because they grew up in the Great Depression. Well, that's a true statement,
Right.
but okay, or they were tough because they grew up poor. Okay, and that's a true statement, but it doesn't answer the question what made them tough. And at least with the Greatest Generation that I grew up with, one common theme, and my granddad did not have this theme, but it was all around him, was how hungry and poor these men grew up. And when I talk about hungry, I'm not talking about missing a meal. I'm talking
Yeah.
about going days without meals
Yeah.
and waking up in the morning as a young youth, and your biggest concern for that day was just trying to find food.
Yeah, we focus so much on the trials they went through during the war, but
Yes.
we never very often see what life was like that built them, right? To
Yes.
that, to the people that they were that were able to accomplish the things that they did. Sometimes I know, like with Band of Brothers, we see their boot camp. It starts kind of
That's
at the
where it
boot
starts.
camp.
Yes.
But the truth
Yeah.
is, for some of these men, they probably enjoyed boot camp because it was a lot easier than their lives coming up to that.
Yes.
And I think that's a really important thing you're pointing out, because as it relates to your book, because
Yes.
it's the first part of your book is actually not a World War II story yet. It's a story of what life is like pre-World War II in the Great Depression. And you have some really fascinating stories about life in this little community. And that's going to be, so it's kind of a multifaceted book that you're capturing. Stories that preceded the war, but really are an important part of the war. And I think that's why your book is so important too, because a lot of times we just focus only on that period. And like you're saying, a lot of even the documentaries that are made about these people, we don't go back and find out, what their lives were like before they became the World War II heroes that they are.
Oh, yeah. And one other aspect I even forgot to talk about was, besides hunger, was the violence of the communities they lived in.
That's interesting.
Most of these men were born in the early 1920s. If you go to, Census Bureau and stuff, the majority of Americans lived in rural America at that time. If you go back, there was very little law and order. And, like my granddad would tell me, he said, son, I really didn't know anybody I grew up with who hadn't witnessed a murder or a violent crime of some,
Wow.
case. And in his personal, in the county he grew up in, had 40,000 people in it. And there were six deputy sheriffs that covered the whole county. And the town of Big Stone was, probably a population around 5,000. And they had a daytime cop and a nighttime cop and a police chief. And so there was very little law and order. Also, and one aspect he would point out, he said, nobody had telephones. So if a violent crime was happening, you couldn't even call the police. So, your law and order was a lot of times having a gun, protecting yourself. And, that was one thing, for these men to grow up in such a violent
You've got a chapter
environment
here titled Not One But Two Murders at Church.
Yes.
Of all places.
Yes.
So violent, the murders are actually happening at church.
And actually my papa's sister is still alive. She's 98 years old as we speak.
Wow.
And we went to visit her, and she was talking about she'd seen some violent thing on the news, and she was talking about, well, gosh, this is such a violent society we live in today. And I actually brought that up, and she said, I forgot about that.
The murders at church.
Yeah, we did have 2 murders at church, didn't we? I guess today's not as bad as.
And there's another one in here. Let me see if I can find it. The one about, help me out, a pistol across the gym floor. It's the title of another chapter. And somebody came to, was that a basketball game? And there was a fight.
Yeah, basketball game. Yes. And the coach. And I'll be honest with you, back in the day, that was common for teachers to have guns and
the preacher had a gun
on their bot.
It got knocked out of his hand it flew across the floor. Anyway, these are they're funny stories, honestly. I mean, they really show you that the good old days weren't exactly the good old days. And
no, if you look at statistics and stuff, and of course in the book, my great grandmother talks a lot about the good old days. Said if somebody's talking about the good old days, they have a bad memory.
Or they watch too much of that. What's that TV show that everybody keeps?
Andy Griffith.
They watch too much Andy Griffith if they think the good old days were that great.
Yes. Yeah. Now that doesn't mean they didn't have good moments. That didn't mean there was a lot of family time. And I think when people talk about the good old days, they miss those intimate times with their family and stuff. And that's what they're really talking about.
Yeah, and we are missing that today. Yeah.
Yes. So, but as far as wanting to go back to those times, my great grandmother said no. Said, I lived through them and I never want to go back to them. We were hungry. It was violent. You worried about your life. There's very little law and order. And of course, you can imagine with that much poverty and that much hunger, how much, theft and violence there was in communities. Because if you're hungry, you can do violent things.
It's interesting.
Just trying to survive.
So tell us the story around the moment when your papa, is what you call him. Am I saying that right?
Mm-hmm.
Papa.
Yep.
When your papa finally opened up and started telling his stories, because he didn't always, right? There's an actual moment that this happened. So would you share that?
No. See, I grew up, I knew he was a B-17 bomber. In fact, as a child, I would play. He had a shoebox full of medals from the war.
Yeah.
And as a child, I'd play with him. And, he had medals. Little ribbons, you name it. It was a shoebox full of them. So I knew. But if you kind of ask him about it, he had a great talent to kind of just brush the subject and then go, oh, no, it wasn't that big a deal, son, and all that. And really wouldn't talk about it much. And at the time, I didn't think that was quite unusual because I just didn't know. And this was in 1991. I come home from college, and Oh no, I'm getting on another side. I'm sorry. But no, this was actually, I was in eighth grade. I
Yes,
was in
yes.
eighth grade, and we'd come home from milking cows that morning. We ate breakfast, and our routine was we'd probably watch a little bit of the morning news before we headed out for the daily chores. And in rural America, and this would have been probably about 1981. We didn't have cable TV, but we had satellite antennas. And this one, the little bitty dishes you see now, these were the great big old 12, 15 footers that you saw. It looked like NASA outside. My grandmother hated it, said it looked like, Cape Canaveral out in
Yeah,
her
they
yard.
did look like
Yes.
they're bigger than
And,
NASA uses today, probably.
oh, it probably is.
You know?
Well, okay, and when you had satellite TV back in those days, you had this box that sat on top of your TV, and you turned the channel, and then you had a little adjuster that could move the satellite antenna. Different satellites get different channels. So, as you can imagine, my papa was in the Lazy Boy, and I was always the de facto remote control. So he'd make me stand up there and turn the channels till he found something he wanted to watch. Well, I'm flipping channels, and he goes, "Stop, let's watch this." And, of course, in the book I put down, I kind of just sit down beside him and I look at the TV, and it was this Blue Blood Country Club horse show. And when I say blue blood, I mean they had the look like tuxedos with the long in the back and the little top hats, and riding these beautiful horses and doing what I know now is dressage. I didn't know what that was at the time. And I remember looking at them and going, "You want to watch this?" I mean, I couldn't. I mean, it was just, why do you want to watch this? We didn't have horses. I'm deathly allergic to horses, so I had no interest in them. And he's all of a sudden he said, "I recognize that place," and I'm like, my knee jerk. Yeah, don't you mean you recognize that place? And he goes, "That was Shell Shock Hotel," and I'm like, "Shell Shock Hotel?" He said, "Yeah, during the war." And then he started, and I said, "What do you mean?" And then he started to tell me the first story was about going to Shell Shock Hotel. And then, of course, the more important story was why they were sent to Shell Shock Hotel. And so that kind of opened the floodgates to stories. And then from then
So
on,
he had
we
gone
looked
there.
at,
That was
yeah,
just, and we'll talk about this we're going to make a playlist just for everybody
yes.
listening. This is just an introductory interview, and then we're going to make a
Mm-hmm.
playlist that we talk about a lot of the stories and chapters in your book. But Shell Shock Hotel was a place that they went to after I think it was 16 months of missions
Mm-hmm.
and danger, as a place to recoup and just kind of get away from the war for a little bit. So that's the reason he called it the Shell Shock Hotel. I guess that's where you went when
And
you
that's what the
started
men
getting
called
shell
it. Yeah.
shock, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So with that,
And
so that was the moment that he kind of started to open up and then tell you all of the stories that you put into this book.
yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
now I've since we've done the book, I've kind of reflected on that moment a little bit. I think he was just ready to talk about it.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's took almost 40 years, but I think, like me, he didn't want to kind of leave this world without maybe his story being told. He was, definitely a kind and soft-spoken man, but he was always kind of a little reserved, and I think he was ready to maybe explain why he wasn't a touchy-feely type
Yeah.
person.
And
I tell this story all,
he really
yeah,
shared some incredible stories with you that you put in
yeah.
this book. Yeah.
And I tell this story that he wasn't a touchy feeling person. He took me off to college, and when he dropped me off from college, he just looked at me and said, "Well, son, don't do nothing stupid and kill yourself." And turned around and walked away. and,
I love it.
and for me, that's very touching.
Yeah,
But if a
that
stranger
was
heard
the
that, they would
touching
think,
goodbye from Grandpa.
yeah,
He
they'd be
actually
going,
took
"What
you
the
to
heck's
college,
that?"
though. He actually dropped you off at college
Well, that's when I left for
as you were
college.
leaving.
Yeah,
Okay,
he
okay,
actually did. Yeah,
that says a lot about him that he took that.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
Um,
a stranger would hear that story and go, "Gosh, that's kind of cold blooded or cold." But for him, it was very kind. But he was a serious man, and his comments, "Don't do nothing stupid, and kill yourself," is kind of his talk of, "I love you and be careful."
yeah. So with that, I was wondering if you would now read an excerpt from your
Yes.
book, and the one that we've selected, I think, plays really well with that sort of that first moment that you discovered he had a lot to share about being in World War II as a bomber pilot, and then give us the setup for this excerpt, or I guess maybe it's in the book itself. Go ahead and share with
Yes,
us.
a little bit of the background. Okay, for especially people under, gosh, my kid's age in the mid 20s, but anybody probably under the age of 40. When you talk about 1991 and the new, CNN was the first. I mean, that was where people watched all their news, and it was live and stuff, and and also the first Gulf War with Iraq and stuff was the first time you were watching a war live on TV. And so that's kind of the setup. And I'll go ahead and read from this. And if you just kind of keep it in mind on, the technology we were watching at the time. I remember visiting my papa one weekend home from college, early February 1991. And we sat in his living room glued to the television set. That day, General Colin Powell and General Norman Schwarzkopf Jr. appeared on CNN, showing live footage of American bombers dropping smart bombs or bunker busters from tens of thousands of feet in the air. We watched in awe as those bombs penetrated small air vents and destroyed seemingly bomb-proof bunkers. It was a moment that left an indelible impression on me, made me realize the power and precision of American military technology. So we're watching this live. I mean, it's kind of an amazing event. The black and white live video on the TV screen depicted the smart bomb being released and tracked it all the way down through the impact and explosion. And just like that, my 72-year-old grandfather leaped up from his lazy boy recliner in excitement as though he just watched his favorite football team score a winning touchdown. Papa practically yelled, "Hot damn, son. If we had had some of those smart bombs back in WWII, me and the boys could have won the war by ourselves. We could have taken out that bastard Hitler with one bomb." It was as if Papa just discovered the eighth wonder of the world, and the way he was carrying on, one might have thought that the war was being fought right there in his living room. Sitting back down, he settled in. He said, "Being able to see that live and to see what they can do now, that's some kind of technology, son." And yeah, and you could just, I mean, he was just fascinated. I mean, so he was watching live the technology and what they were doing in 1991 compared to what he was doing in 1944 and the difference. So, it was amazing for him. And yeah, he couldn't believe what they could do.
Yeah, I just think that's such an incredible moment to have included in your book, because it shows the distance in a way that we've come in just one generation.
Yes.
In our warfare.
Yes.
And then for him to actually witness it, I love his enthusiasm. He just leaps up out of his lazy boy. Hot damn, we could have won the war just by ourselves. I just love that. It's so much the spirit of Jimmie, because he really is quite a character.
Yes, and the lifelong. Now he came from a family, and my whole family loved technology. Now I'm not it's not like I'm a computer expert and stuff, but we always embraced it, and we always tried to look on the best side of technology. Of course, I tell stories about church and stuff. I can remember one church sermon. This was in the 90s too, when the internet was first coming out, and our local preacher was preaching against the evils of the internet, spreading evil and all that. And after church, that preacher asked my granddad what he thought of it, and he said, "Preacher man," he said, "I don't know much about this internet." And he said, "I'm sure you're not wrong." But he said, "Somebody also told me Billy Graham had a website on that internet too."
Yeah.
So, his point was, technology is just a tool. How we use it is whether it's good or evil.
Yeah.
And, and not saying that using technology warfare is good. We all know that's terrible and stuff. But what he was watching on TV just couldn't get over how far technology had gone from what he'd done in between 1943 and 45.
Yeah, because they really didn't have much technology, and some of the things they had to do just to even keep warm at the heights they flew is amazing.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
and but I'm still amazed how they can navigate. I mean, we're so used to GPS, and I couldn't imagine the now his brother John, who's also got one chapter about him, was a P-51 Mustang pilot. And I mean, actually, what he did was probably technically more dangerous than almost any other occupation in the military because of, they had a little bit of guidance, they had a little bit of technology to help them navigate. But if they were wrong, I mean, they would die.
Yeah, there's a lot on the
Because
line
you're
for these
trying to hit a
guys.
small spot in the middle of the Atlantic, and if you were off by 50 miles, you ran out of gas.
Yeah.
And this one of radio, GPS or satellite phone you could use to say, hey, to get help.
Well, John, we're going to be recording a lot more shows depicting these different stories and really getting down into it. So just to kind of wrap up this one, I wondered if you might be willing to share some of your advice for anyone who is aspiring to write and possibly publish a book like you have.
Put this, I'm about as unlikely of a writer as you could imagine. I never had even given it much thought, but I did love stories, and there were stories that I wanted to preserve, if for no other reason, just for my own children and grandchildren. And there's so many families out there that have such great stories, and we hope to uncover more of them that need to be preserved. And they're the little stories, the little funny stories that even at the time you might think nobody else would have much interest in them. Get them down, preserve them. What always kept me from even thinking about like writing a book was, it'd been so long since I'd written anything, but I didn't quite know the book industry like yourself. Editors help you with all the ins and outs on the writing part. Get the story down. If it's a great story, it's worth doing the other work to make it happen. And if it's a great story, other people will want to hear it.
That's absolutely right. I'm glad that you said that. I think a lot of times people are reluctant and they don't believe in themselves, and they just don't get started, and they think, oh, I don't know how to write well, I don't know grammar. That stuff can come later. You don't have to worry about that. Just write what you know, write what you've been told, write what you've heard, write what matters. And the rest will come together. And the truth be told, there's a lot of really good examples of books out there where the grammar isn't perfect. I've even read books that maybe jump in, the tenses change, or the perspective jumps from third person to first person. And you know what? There's still valuable stories, and some of them are really successful books. So, which isn't to say don't hire a publisher. Like Triumph Press.
No, I think that's
I think
it's
you're gonna. There's no reason not to put the best material out there, but it can be a team effort. And whether you get to the point that you've reached, I'm so glad you reached this point, John, because I think your book is truly going to be very successful. It already is successful. In fact, let me bring this point up. First of all, you have an amazing best-selling author who wrote your foreword. And it's a phenomenal foreword by Adriana Trigiani. I'm saying that right. See her name there. So she was willing to.
Many thanks to her.
Many thanks to her. Just, I wish I had prepared an excerpt, but we're running out of time. Just to read what she said. That then, when we did release the book, you went to #1, hot new release on Amazon in the World War II section. You also had enough people excited about your book that you became a bona fide #1 best-selling author during the period that it was first released. You were able to sell enough books both to be a hot new release and a bestseller all at once, which I think is a phenomenal accomplishment, and very much speaks to the quality of your book and the stories and their importance. So I appreciate you joining me today and letting everybody learn a little bit more about you and your book. And for all of you that enjoyed this interview with John Peace, be sure to subscribe to this channel, like this video, subscribe, because there will be more videos coming with John. And with that, John, thank you so much. We'll look forward to seeing you.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm sure right here, I'll be putting a link to the next video that you can watch and learn about how Captain Jimmie Galloway was able to draft his bomber crew.